Okay. At this time, I'd like to bring the December 15th, 2020 special called board meeting for the Richland 2 Board of Trustees to order. If I can please have a motion to approve the agenda.
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Mackey.
I move to approve the agenda for the December 15th, 2020 special call board meeting of the Richland 2 School Board of Trustees.
Motion's been made by Ms. Mackey. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Dr. Caution Parker. Is there any discussion? With no discussion, is everybody logged in? We'll do a voice vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 6-0. We will now move on to item 3.1, addressing systems of inequity. Dr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, members of the board, and to our viewing public, as well as to our staff that is here, executive and leadership team. It gives me great pride and joy for us to have this conversation this afternoon or this evening. We have been talking and I think have stood at the forefront in the state of South Carolina as it relates to school districts, being one of the very first school districts in the state, if not the first school district in the state, to create and hire a diversity and multicultural inclusion officer. Following that, we've also one of the first school districts, if not the first school district, to actually create and pass an equity policy at the district level. Two things that I think are very important as we continue to move forward in our work to ensure that all of our students are receiving premier educational experiences in our school district. Society needs school districts and leaders who are committed to the idea that all students deserve access to high quality educational opportunities and experiences. And it's important for us to know that in order for us to create an equitable system when it comes to education, we must first identify and dismantle the inequities that may exist. We started out by having a very broad view of inequities as we began our discussions about inequity and inequality in our district. And we quickly realized that important for us to be effective and to do what's best for our schools, we actually had to look inwardly and look at what we were doing as a school district and not necessarily focus so much on the very broad issues of inequity, but more specifically, what are we doing in Richland School District 2 to identify things or systems of inequity? How do we then dismantle those ineffective practices and systems that do not allow us to ensure that all of our students are receiving educational or premier educational experiences and opportunities? And then what do we do to then build new, more equitable systems for our students? We can't believe that we can prepare our students to be global citizens of tomorrow, citizens prepared to lead and excel in their chosen pathways, or even to be competitive if we provide them with a system of education that is not equitable and meets their needs. And so today, this evening, we have our Chief Diversity and Multicultural Inclusion Officer, Dr. Helen Grant, who will share with us and walk us through some rich discussion about equity and inequities in our school district, as well as for us to participate in some in an activity that will help us get a better understanding of where we are and what do we need to do next as we continue to move forward in our school district and address these systems and practices. Dr. Grant.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, and to Mr. Manning and members of our school board. I'm glad to get here. We were scheduled earlier for this and we had to change it, certainly due to other board business. And so I'm just happy to have this opportunity. I'll say to you that I am going to do my best to stay at this podium. This is very unusual for me to have to stand still, especially in a work session. If we had our way, we would be in a circle and we would do some work in teams and have lots of opportunity, but we understand that because of the restrictions, we're going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to try to keep it upbeat, try to keep it fun for you as we go through, keep it relatively informal. So at any point, if you have questions, if you have comments or concerns, just turn your mic on and let's talk about them. We can use this as a conversation time for us as we move through. So, addressing systems of inequity. I always like to start with some group norms, not because I don't think you know how to handle yourselves in these kinds of situations, but because it's always good to remind everyone of just some ground rules that we like to follow. They're pretty easy. Respect for people and thoughts is extended and received. No question is a dumb or insignificant question unless it's a question that you have or a comment that you have that you'd like to have addressed and you don't ask it. Silence will not be taken to mean disinterest, but I hope that you will share your thoughts with us tonight. And then when in doubt, turn to wonder. Sometimes people ask me, what do I mean by that? And I mean simply that if I say something or if someone else says something that just sounds crazy to you or foreign to you, or you can't figure out where they're coming from before responding, turn to wonder. I wonder why they said that. I wonder why they said it the way they said it. I wonder what their life experiences have been to cause them to have that particular opinion. And then think about what you really want to ask. It, I think, helps to foster communication. And I'm certainly willing to add any, if you have any other group norms that you'd like us to do this evening, we can add. If not, we'll move forward. All right. So when you first came in, I had something up on our board, our classroom board, for you to think about. And so now I'm going to ask you to use what hopefully you thought about when you first came in. Effective and productive conversations work better when people know each other and when there's some trust that's involved, that you know you can say how you feel without ever thinking you're going to be attacked for how you feel or be attacked for what you said. And so this activity is designed just to help us build trust. Ms. McFadden is new to this board, and she and I have not had a chance to really get to know each other well. And so if for no other reason, this will allow us an opportunity to get to know each other a little better, and hopefully for you to do the same as we go through it. So you're going to have 1 minute. And what I've asked you to do in that 1 minute is to tell us one thing, just one thing, about yourself that will help us to understand you better. And I can take volunteers for who would like to go first. And if not, I have an order set aside and I will volunteer you that it's your turn. But if you would like to volunteer, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to walk over and get my hourglass over there. It's a 2-minute hourglass. So when you see it getting close to half, you're out of time. And so hopefully you've had a moment to think about what you want to say. And while I'm walking, you can decide if you want to volunteer.
I guess I'll volunteer before I get voluntold. So even though I was raised in the South, my family's all originally from Pennsylvania. So my roots are all from the North, and I'm first generation raised in the South.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. Who would like to go next? Dr. Teresa Holmes, Madam Vice Chair.
I knew you were ready to call me.
So I know you're ready.
Okay. The one thing I'd like to know about myself probably would be that I'm a direct person. I'm a very direct, straightforward kind of person, but I'm not a mean person. I think sometimes when people assume that, especially with females, if you're direct, that you're mean. But my directness is just because that's the way that I was raised. I like to know facts. I like to know what's going on, so I ask questions. So if I am direct to anybody, please don't take it like I am being mean. I'm just asking questions and I'm getting to the point. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that my directness has nothing to do with me being nasty. I'm just straight to the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Caution Parker.
I like to get to the bottom line. Don't waste my time with all the explanations and everything. Give me the bottom line. What is the problem? What's the issue? And then I can try to work my way backwards with that. But a lot of times people are offended, I guess, by the way I say it. Like Dr. Holmes, I'm probably pretty direct. And you have to be in a lot of businesses and things that you do this for. You have to be. But I like to get to the bottom line. I don't like to waste time.
Thank you so much. Dr. Elkins.
Yes, I would like to say, I was raised by my grandmother, and she always said with us as kids, if you can learn more about a person by their actions than their words. So I would say that I'm the type of person that I watch what you do, not so much what you say, just to see if they line up. So I'm more on an action than words.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elkins. Another volunteer? Ms. McFadden.
I thought you were going to say Miss Mackey for. Okay, so one thing about me is I am a country girl, literally. My whole family was born and raised in the South. I have very strong traditional values. I've ran into some situations where, I've had to adjust some of my thought processes because sometimes as you're traveling through life, things change and you have to adjust your moral compass, I guess. So I do have strong traditional values. And by the way, guys, I have a twin sister who looks exactly like me, running around Richland too. She actually works in Richland too. So if you see her and she doesn't speak to you, it is not me. Her name is Miss Butler. But yeah, so that's just one thing I would like to say that, I have some strong opinions on things. I can be swayed, but you got to give me a good argument. It's got to make sense. It's got to work. But that's where I'm coming from. So that's what I'd like everyone to know about me.
Thank you so much, Ms. McFadden. I'm glad to know you have a twin sister. So now I'll know to be sure and ask to make sure I know who I'm speaking with. Ms. Mackey.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Something about me that I'm an only child of an educator who is very much like Dr. Caution Parker with her delivery and her personality, puts it out there. And as a result, I probably grew up trying to be very diplomatic. So I am extremely diplomatic in the things that I try to say, and will have a hard time receiving it if I can't. We'll have a hard time receiving the message if the delivery is kind of tough. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You did a wonderful job. I didn't even feel a need to model for you, but I will share with you, education is vitally important in my family. My parents both come from Clarendon County, South Carolina. My mother's family was involved in the Briggs versus Elliott case and lost her teaching job because her father would not take his name off of the petition asking for equal funding of schools. And so I grew up in a household where education was paramount. Everything that I have done in my professional life has led me to this point. I thoroughly enjoy the work that I do in Richland District 2. I thoroughly enjoy being of service to you as members of this board and to our entire school district. And so I look forward to us having a wonderful discussion this evening, and we're going to get started. So our essential question for this evening: how do we identify systems of inequity in our school district? And once identified, how do we rectify those inequities? I try to include in my presentations to staff all across the district, as I've done with you, as many of the AVID principles as possible. And one of those AVID principles is to have an essential question. And so that's what we're talking about this evening. I got from Dr. Davis, when he spoke with a group this past week here in the district, this quote from James Baldwin: "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated." As Dr. Davis said it, as educators begin to become conscious, they must begin to examine the way they are educating a society. We are on a journey. I wish that I could tell you where the end was and the time frame for when we would get there. That I don't know. This is a journey towards equity. So as we strive to be premier, we will strive to be equitable in everything that we do. It's going to come in steps. It's going to come in phases. Some things will come quicker than others, but it may take us a while to get to a point where we feel like we're saying comfortably, we are an equitable school district. But it is the journey that we are on, and we look forward to everything that comes with the journey. Sometimes there are bumps, sometimes there's smooth highways, sometimes you're worried about where the next gas station is and whether or not you're going to make it there. But we get there, we keep going, working together, we can do it. So we know, if you've spent any time in South Carolina, and Ms. McFadden, I know originally you're from another state, but you've been here for several years now, and Tennessee, I think it is that you're from. So some similar experiences, I'm sure, in Tennessee, that inequities exist for marginalized people in places with a history of systemic oppression, racism, or discrimination. It just naturally evolves that if there is a history of that, there are going to be some repercussions that come down the road. And so based on South Carolina's history, or whatever history you would like to use, I'd like for you to share with us, in what areas would you anticipate that we might today be facing inequities? Dr. Holmes? Salaries. Generally, or education? Across the board. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Literally resources, where there are disparities with regard to tax bases and communities, and there may be disparities with regard to resources, textbooks, facilities, things of that nature.
Absolutely. Housing, yes. Employment, yes. And Dr. Elkins, anytime you want to jump in, please do that. I can't see from what's in front of me if you're raising your hand or trying to get my attention, so please just jump in.
What was the question? Because I can't see it.
Yeah, the question is, we know that inequities exist for marginalized people in places with a history of systemic oppression, racism, or discrimination. And we were talking about what areas where we might expect to find some of that based on South Carolina.
Okay. I would say gender.
We might expect that, yes, ma'am. We know that that is an area where there has been a history of discrimination. I just listed some. You've done a wonderful job of opening up the arena of where we might find these inequity: housing, healthcare, wealth building, access to technology, certainly in education. Education is not immune from the impact of systemic oppression. And I wanted us to have a little bit of a sense. Yes, sir, Dr. Davis.
So I was just going to say, Dr. Grant, just as also maybe another question would be, where wouldn't you find systems of or inequities that exist in whatever systems that we have in place, and not just in South Carolina, but in this country, period? Where could we find something where it does not exist, whether it's in religion or in education, in finance? Maybe that's even a question to ponder. Is there a place that does not exist for marginalized groups?
Right off the top, I can't think of anything to tell you, any area. I'm open to hear suggestions. I imagine that if there was something newly created that was created in a place that was equitable, we might have that, but I could not tell you where that is and what that is. All right. Well, the activity is designed to help you see history maybe from a little bit of a different perspective. On your desk are some very brightly neon-colored sheets. There are 2 sheets, and they're divided into time periods. And then within the little Ziploc bag, there are little squares or tiles. And what I'd like for you to do is try to figure out, for as many of those as you can, where you think the time frame is for your the whatever is listed on the tile. And once you get it all out, maybe I can get you started with a couple of them and see if we can move from there. For example, Jim Crow laws. If you see that one, it'll be a free one for you. Those came into being in 1865. So they would go under the column of 1800 to 1899 is where the Jim Crow laws would go. And so if we can, just take a few minutes and let you work with that. Again, if we were in non-COVID times, we would work in groups and it would go a little bit faster. And we won't take a lot of time on it. I have the actual answers for you, but I'd like for you to take a look and see if you can figure out. One or two are a little tricky. I'll just give you that advance notice. Staff, I think I have about 3 more. If any of you would like to play along and figure it out, I'd be happy to bring you one. All right, here's a clue to let you know if you're close. Under the first time frame of 1600 to 1800, there are 3 tiles. Under the second time frame, there are 9 tiles, and that would be 1800 to 1899. Under the third time frame of 1900 to 1960, there are 5 tiles. And under the final one, 1961 to 2020, there are 8 tiles. Maybe about 20 more seconds. Probably should have asked if there were any history buffs in the audience. Might have an unfair advantage. All right, I'm gonna let you see how well you did in this. I was thinking that that very first category would be pretty easy, that 1600 to 1800 category. Where as far back as 1619, I found a reference to the enslaved people arriving in South Carolina, as far back as 1619. 1663 or thereabouts, I saw a couple of different dates about when the Carolina colony was founded, but 1710 is when the Carolinas split into North Carolina and South Carolina. So that one I think was a little easier than the others to do. That second category, we get the 1800 to 1899. With the biggest thing happening there, the Civil War, because most of what else is on your tiles is kind of a fallout from the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Jim Crow laws, which came right after the Civil War, 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up to help recently freed people learn how to live and conduct business and take care of themselves and be educated. Juneteenth, the celebration of when in Texas, enslaved people were informed that the Civil War was over and that they were no longer enslaved. In South Carolina, we had a constitution in 1868 that allowed men to vote, that created integrated public schools and established equality regardless of race. Did you know that happened as far back as 1868? And then the first desegregation of the University of South Carolina. Did you know that that happened in 1873 through 1877? So immediately after the Civil War, during emancipation, people of color had tremendous rights and exercised those rights, including the right to vote and the right to be educated. In 1896 was when the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case was decided that upheld the separate but equal doctrine. And that's the last of the ones that's in the 1800 to 1899 category. Then that next period of time might have been a little difficult deciding which things belonged under 1900 to 1960 and which belonged from 1961 to 2020. But 1941, Albert Thompson won an equal pay lawsuit in Columbia schools. And I tried to find things that related directly to us, as close to home as I could get for us. That was in 1941. South Carolina State College at that time formed a law school in 1947, and that was done because it was an effort to keep people of color out of the University of South Carolina's law school. That law school produced very famous and well-known judges, including the first Black judge after Reconstruction in South Carolina. Then in 1951, the Briggs versus Elliott case in Clarendon County was going on. Also in 1951, a 3% sales tax was enacted to equalize school facilities in order to avoid integrating the schools, so that since the Supreme Court had said separate but equal was okay, taxes were enacted in order to try to make facilities equal. We know that that did not happen, but there was a law where 3% sales tax was put in place. Then in 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which said that separate schools are inherently unequal. Also in 1954, I don't think I have this on your tiles, but I just like to tell it because Rosa Parks was not the first woman that sat down on a bus. Sarah Mae Fleming, right here in Columbia, was on a bus and was ejected because she sat in a white-only section. She was assaulted and ejected from the bus. And litigants and attorneys came to study her case in preparation for the case that Rosa Parks took forward as well. In 1963, the University of South Carolina was desegregated for the second time. So 1963 was not the first desegregation, it was the second. And in 1964, that following year, schools in Columbia, South Carolina, including Richland District 2, were desegregated. In 1968, the Orangeburg Massacre. I'm not going to go through all of these. In 2015, we know that the Confederate battle flag was removed from the State House. But did you know that in 1962 is when it was put on the top of the State House? 1962, that was my lifetime when that happened. Removed in 2015, and in 2019, Richland 2 adopted its equity policy. Part of the reason I wanted us to go through that little exercise is because sometimes when we think about a history of oppression, we want to couch it in terms of something that happened a long time ago. And I carry in my phone, and I'm sorry I did not pull it up before I came to the podium tonight, a picture of my great-grandmother's grave. Her name was Ellen Reagan. She was born in 1865. This is my mother's grandmother. And so that's not that long ago. That's 3 generations from me. But she was born at the end of slavery. And so when you think about it in that context, then you think that's really not that long ago, especially for us here in South Carolina, that we had the active, explicit segregation, discrimination, and racism. And so that when we think about what we have in place now, the remnants of those things that have come down through the years, maybe it's a little easier to understand how some of it is still here, how some of it is still left over, because in the total scheme of things, it has not yet been that long. Dr. Davis did a wonderful job in his opening explaining what we're about as it relates to equity in Richland District 2. We have been charged to identify what we're doing well, and we want to keep going with those things that we're doing well. Then we want to identify the systems and practices of inequity. We want to dismantle those inequitable systems and build more equitable systems. And I'm sorry, my numbers are off. Should be 1, 2, 3, and 4, not 1, 2, and 1, 2. But that's the sequence that we're working through. And so because we're starting on a positive, because I would not want anyone here or anyone listening to think that we are not doing good work, that good things are not happening in Richland 2, because good things are happening in Richland 2. We want to think about what it is that we are doing positive as it relates to equity. And if you have thoughts on that, I'd love for you to share either programs that you're aware of, actions that this board has taken, whatever it is that you can think of that seems to be moving us forward in a positive manner as it relates to equity.
Dr. Grant, I'd like to just share something. I know that there will be specific programs that people will mention, but one of the, I was actually a part of an AP Scholars presentation today, and one of the students who shared his thesis with me was talking about equity and equality in the education system. And he gave lots of examples of why he thinks those things are important. And he said, well, I'm not going to talk about Richland 2 because I think that they're doing a good job here, but I will talk about other areas. So for him to have even said something like that, he's a senior, it made me feel good. It indicated progress, that's for certain, for a child to think that.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Grant?
Yes, ma'am.
One thing that comes to mind is I think that kudos to our board and individuals on our board, because when we started out with the equity piece, one thing that we said was that we wanted teachers to be able to recognize some of their innate biases and work on those things because we all have them. And one thing that I appreciate is that when Dr. Davis, that we talked about from the very beginning, was making sure that we got teachers across the board introduced to cultural competency which was a major piece for me because that's actually what my dissertation is on. So that was a major thing for me and I appreciate the board and Dr. Davis taking that and going forward with that, because students have to feel wanted by the people that teach them, because that's an important part of competency for especially minority students.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And we make sure that every time professional development is offered in the district, there are multiple offerings along those veins so that everybody, all staff, have the opportunity to take part in it. So, Dr. Caution Parker.
I know I'm the oldest one. I'm the oldest one in this room. But I think about when we first started this, I thought about when we moved, my family. My dad was military, Army drill sergeant, and we moved here from Germany. We'd been overseas 3 times and had lived there like 10 years. And I was 16. It was the first time in my life I ever lived off an Army post and lived in public housing and went to a public school, which of course was Barron and I's alma mater, C.A. Johnson High School. And that was the first time I'd ever been in an all segregated situation. And my parents and I used to argue about it all the time. I told them they did not prepare us well at all. The 3 girls in the family. And I think the one that really caught the blunt of a lot of things was probably my youngest sister. But I remember that in those days. I also think about when I came to Richland too. I did my student teaching here in '79, fall of '79, under Charlene Herring over at E.L. Wright. And I just remember looking around and counting 5 African-American teachers at E.L. Wright. We had 57-something people on the staff and only 5 African-Americans. And I decided I wanted to come to Richland 2 because Richland 2 needed me. They didn't know they needed me, but they needed me. And I needed to be here. And that was one thing that really kept me going here. And then I think about 1990 when we first had our first 2 African-Americans elected to the school board. One went to high school with me, Sylvia Hanna. We went to high school together, and Melinda Anderson. And Melinda stayed on the board, of course, for years, and Sylvia, I think, served 1 term before she got off. But I know that there was a lot of controversy during that time and a lot of things that we weren't privy to. But John Hudgens was the one that kind of led us through that. And he also started in the 80s, I know it was in the 80s, the Minority Recruitment Committee. And I was part of that as well. Recruiting minorities to Richland School District 2. And Curtis Watson was one of the ones. Some of you probably remember Curtis, and it was a lot going on then, a lot going on. But I still said to my parents, my mother passed away in 2008, that they did not prepare my sisters and I well at all for what we were facing, coming from overseas and walking into a segregated situation. It took a lot. It took a lot for us to really settle in. Yeah.
Dr. Grant, I have to piggyback off something what Dr. Caution Parker said. We moved here from Morristown, New Jersey. And when I moved here from Morristown, New Jersey, I'm a graduate of Spring Valley High School. When Spring Valley High School did not have many who looked like me. Yeah. And I went to E.L. Wright Middle School. So I started there when we moved here. And my whole entire K through 12 years in school, even when I was in New Jersey, I've only had 1 minority teacher. I want everybody to think about that. K through 12, my whole entire schooling, I never saw any teachers but 1, and that was Miss Wilson at E.L. Wright Middle School, that looked like me. And one thing that came to mind, because I moved into a segregated situation from a situation that was not that way, it was shocking. I was like Cheryl, I was ill prepared. I was shocked for that. That's the first time I had been called out of my name and everything. And we moved into an all Caucasian neighborhood, which that's a whole nother story. So for me, that was really key. And that's why cultural competency for me is important. I had parents at home who pushed education and pushed us along. So I had that self-motivation from within. But I can remember times when I felt like I was discriminated against. I can remember classes where I was taking college prep and everybody else was at the Voc Ed Center that looked like me. I can remember there were only 3 of us in a class. I can remember when the teacher would not call on me and we would make jokes about how, okay, you know, he's gonna skip on me. And my classmates would, because we were all friends, my class would be like, she's calling you. So it was like a joke, but it's not really a joke because I just was strong enough to handle that. But I put myself in a situation where I think of students who can't handle that. So people who don't understand the importance of having a teacher in a classroom that looks like your population, I can tell you it is important because I was that student that only had 1 minority teacher my whole educational career. Thanks.
Dr. Grant, I've had an opportunity to not only serve as an administrator in the district since 1999, and work my way through the ranks in our school district as an assistant administrator, assistant principal, and had the opportunity to leave and learn and then come back home and continue my professional career in Richland too. And there are a lot of things that I think as we are practicing this appreciative inquiry that I know our board has done a lot of tremendous things over the time that, you know, that maybe they don't necessarily can recall right off the top of their heads. And I know Mr. Manning and Dr. Elkins and Dr. Kasha Parker has been connected to the district for an extended period of time, as well as Dr. Holmes being a former student in the district, as well as a longtime parent, and Ms. Mackey and Ms. McFadden as well. But just to kind of help with this process, I do want to kind of point the board in a direction that they've gone, you know, just to give them an opportunity to, and particularly for those who are viewing, to understand how far we've come in this practice, because we do have a long way to go. We still have a lot of work to do, and this can be a very difficult conversation to have from time to time, and this is something we're working on, is making sure that we feel comfortable having this conversation, talking about the inequities that we have, talking about issues that may issues that may appear to be racist or working to be anti-racist, disparities or challenges that we put in place, and for others that we may not even be aware of that we're doing. So we want to make this a conscious thing, but for us. But just for example, you know, we have pushed for non-traditional AP students to have more access to AP courses and rigorous courses in our school district. That's been something that has been done at all 5 high schools all 4 of the 5 high schools when we adopted the NIMSI project as well. And the board was super supportive of that process. The culture relevant pedagogy, or culture relevant competencies that Dr. Holmes talked about, and the number of teachers who have gone through that, and our continued efforts to ensure that we're doing we're culturally relevant in our approach to working with all of our students. The Premier 100 is another example of that. We've done equity. We're working on an equity audit. The passage of the bond has allowed us to have equitable facilities in our school districts. So regardless of whether or not our students are on one side of the district or the other side of the district, our students have high quality facilities that they can attend schools in. You're not going to walk in one building, although the building structures may be different because of their age. You're not going to walk in one school and see that this group of students have a resource and this group of students don't. So when we went one-to-one, everybody got one-to-one. Doesn't matter what school you go to. It was a high poverty school, a high affluent school from a position of socioeconomics. Everyone got access to that type of material, and that's something that the board was instrumental in ensuring that was going to happen. The hiring of your office, the creation of that office, and the funding and hiring for that office, the creation of our equity policy is another example of that. Giving voice to the community, teacher voice or employee voice. So we have a faculty advisory council, we have a classified advisory council, we have a student advisory council, we have a parent advisory council, we meet with the business members of our community, we meet with the faith-based members of our community, all on an ongoing basis. We meet with student leaders on a regular basis as well. So giving voice to the community is something that has been very, very a big part of what our district has done to create that allows us to create equity and here where there may be inequities that exist, The funding and allocation, how we fund our schools and how we allocate for our schools. Those schools that have more students in poverty receive more funding per pupil in our school district. So we ensure that those needs are being met through the funding of our district. We've had an extensive and very robust conversation about addressing the dress code and dress code biases. We've had some conversations about that and made some adjustments to the dress code to ensure that our dress code was not inherently biased against girls in our school district. That creates equity. That's an area where we've been working on to address equity. And then we've also worked to reduce expulsions for our students, which was disproportionately affecting African American males in our school district by creating pathways to promotion. So those are just off the top of my head, just sitting here listing 11, 12 things that this board and this district have done just within a short period of time. And that's not to include the hiring of the first African American superintendent, hiring of the first African American high school principal. Dr. Suber, I believe, has that distinction at Richland Northeast High School as the first African American high school principal in the district's history, and that being a female, so that should accomplish that. And then as well, the hiring of that old principal at Spring Valley that was there for a couple years that followed her shortly after that. So I think the district has done just some, and those are just some quick off the top things that I think are visible to everyone, but not necessarily recognizable in the district's unintentional necessarily efforts to work toward equity. Now that we're actually focused on it, it's just going to be amazing, I think, where we're going to see ourselves at over the next several years.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And I would add to that, I think just last board meeting, this board spoke about the persistence of making sure that we have small minority women-owned businesses as part of our bond projects in the district. Again, another way that we are already looking at equity, trying to make sure that we're moving forward in an equitable manner. And so I appreciate that summary. And Dr. Davis, you have helped us on our time that we can move forward quickly. One of the other things I'll mention is we're a district-wide AVID program. And the mission of the AVID program is to close those opportunity gaps for students with that focus on the rigor, breaking down barriers, aligning the work, and advocating for students. We also have going on now our MTSS system where equity is in the middle of the system, supported by the layered systems of support, the strong universal core instruction, collaboration, high quality instruction, strategic use of data, and et cetera. And so there are many things that we are doing. I'd like for us, your equity policy, I'm not going to go through the policy. It is in the, at the back of the little folder that you have with the newsletter, and the administrative rule that goes along with the policy is there as well. I will share with you in case you have not seen it. We do have a graphic that can be found on the website as well, our equity lens. It's taken from those considerations that are in the administrative rule to help us to evaluate everything that we do to determine, are we moving forward in an equitable manner? These are some that I chose to go around the outside of the lens, but you could pick any of them to decide whether or not the lesson plan is equitable, the policy is equitable, everything in between to determine if it's equitable. And so we have data. Our time, I don't think, is going to allow us to get into a lot of the data tonight, and I can share the data with you that we have. Part of what we're doing as an administrative group is on a couple of different fronts. We are working with the National Superintendents Association. We have a 5-person equity cohort. Dr. Davis was gracious to allow me to lead that cohort, and I have 4 people on the team in addition to me. We're receiving professional development on a national level from experts in the field. We, on the 3rd Saturday at 11 o'clock, have professional development, and everybody in the cohort has agreed to give that weekend time to this work, with the goal of building a team of people who are very thoroughly trained in this to help us move forward. The other thing that we're doing, we have an equity work group. You're going to hear next month from the Knowledge Opportunity Task Force. We're working very closely with them to try to make sure that we are evaluating our systems, our protocols, our practices, everything that we do in the district from a lens of equity. Is this something that provides an opportunity for all of our students? Is this something that has an inherent bias built into it that hinders some of our students, so that we know where we are? The other thing that we're in the process of doing that we should have ready right after the King holiday will be an equity survey. We're working with the Hanover Research Group that has done an equity audit, which is where I got the data from that is in the presentation that I can make available to you. They are also working on an equity survey for us that will give us a baseline to help us understand how our students feel, our middle and high school students, how our entire staff feels, how our parents feel about the job that we're doing right now with equity. I think it's important to start with that information so we get all different perspectives. That's where our strength is. Diversity is a strength if you use it as a strength. And so having that information is very important as we move forward in our analysis of where we are in the district, where we need to go. The next step in that process is to determine anything that we find that does not meet our equity lens, what needs to happen with it, and how do we prioritize that work. We can't do everything at once, and so we'll look at what can we get the biggest bang for right off the bat, so that we can start that work, make those changes, and then continue to build and continue to build and continue to build. As circumstances change, the equity work will change. So that if we could just put a pin in this moment in time and say, just based on what we know today, here's what needs to be done, we could see an end. But we know that tomorrow will bring something else. The weather is changing outside as we're sitting in here tonight, so we know that things are constantly changing. We have to change with them. As our student population changes, the needs of our student change as well. As our staff changes, the needs of our staff change as well. And so we are committed to looking at the entire school district, both our students and their needs, our staff and the needs of our staff, the community as much as we can. Richland 2 does a lot in our community. We provide resources out to the community, both in terms of people resources, serving on boards, on community organizations, giving of their time to provide expertise in the community, as well as providing food for students in the community and for families in the community, and all of the other things that we do to make us special as Richland District 2. So we'll be looking at all of that information, and really just wanted to, before I wrap up and turn it back over to Dr. Davis, just ask, now that we've kind of given an introduction, I told you this was a journey. We would not get to the end of it tonight. We've just kind of started to loosen up the soil a little bit and think about equity and what that really means, that it's not the same as equality. I didn't think I needed to go through that with you. But when we really start thinking about how do we provide the appropriate support for every student, for each student, so that every student, that Helen gets what she needs, that James gets what he needs, that Barron gets what he needs, that James Ann gets what she needs. How do we go about providing those supports? Really wanted to hear from you if there were any particular areas where you felt like, spend some time looking at this. I'm not sure, or you may say, I'm concerned about this, or I just want to know more about that. If there are particular areas, I would love to hear from you about what you see from your perspective as board members, so that as we start this work and move along on that journey, we can pay attention to it.
Question?
Yes, Ms. McFadden.
I was just going to say I love this presentation. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't know that I know now, and I took pictures so that I can teach my kids because this is interesting. I appreciate your presentation. But I was going to say that I've seen some things that say STEM and some that say STEAM, and the difference is A for the arts. I remember at one point Miss Mackey had a presentation, an inspirational moment where there was a young boy and he was drumming and drumming everywhere and he kept getting in trouble. And then they found an avenue for him. And I had, before I was able to get onto the board, I had to do an interview with some of the teachers here in the arts program. And I do think it's very important because where some people need that avenue as a drummer, some need theater. Not everyone only excels as far as bookwork, you know. And so looking into programs of music, arts, different types of, I don't know them all, I'm just telling you the ones that I know, but I think we need to start looking into that. I know there are some great programs here, but I would be remiss not to mention that because I told those who interviewed me that I would mention it for them on their behalf. So just the arts program, from STEAM to STEM, there's a difference, just like there's a difference between equity and equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. McFadden. We know that different students show mastery and achievement in different ways, but if we're only judging it one way, then we're missing some students. And so that falls right in line with some of the conversations we've started to have, that we need to look at how we measure student achievement to make sure that we are appropriately taking in the strengths of all of our students.
Dr. Grant.
Yes, ma'am, Dr. Holmes.
One area that I think that we still need to kind of look at is making sure that we have equity in a lot of the magnet programs and the acceptance for the magnet programs and some of our advanced programs, looking at making sure that we have equity in the admission to those particular types of programs.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Caution Parker.
Including my time on the board, I've been in the district 40 years now, a little over 40 years. And to look at where we were in 79 and to where we are now, and to look at where we are just under the leadership of Dr. Davis, it's just amazing to me how far we've come. And I know some of you younger people don't see that, you can't really understand it or just can't see that. But when you look at where we were in 79 and here we are in 2020 and the programs that we have for our children and everything we offer our community as a whole, it is phenomenal. It is phenomenal. I know there's more to be done and there's more that we're going to be doing, but to me, the growth has been phenomenal. And I can see the changes. I can see it.
Yes, ma'am. And one of the things as we go on this journey, we want to make sure that everyone understands is that we're not trying to take anything away from any group or for any program. We just want to add to it. We want to make it accessible for everyone, for all of our students to have those same opportunities. So in areas where we're doing really good work, if it's something in the gifted and talented program where we're doing really good work, we want to have everyone to have that opportunity to have those same experiences, to experience that really good work. Dr. Elkins.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Grant. I would like to see more equity in our CAPE programs. As I mentioned before, we know that college is the big thing in many families, but also college is not for everyone. So I would love to see us take a deep dive into looking at equity in our CAPE programs, because many of our students cannot afford to attend college, and some are not interested in a four-year college. There's so much money out there in career tech and Midlands Tech and some of our two-year programs. So I would love to see us go back to the way it used to be, even back in the day with our CAPE programs, auto mechanic, welding, air conditioning, home ec, some of those programs I think is very important. I often reflect on some of the students that I ran into when I was out campaigning that said to me that they had to leave high school, attend Midlands Tech, and pay money to go to barbering school, to go to the CNA programs. When we actually offer those programs, we only offer those programs in certain schools. So I would love to go back and have a conversation about how we can include equity into our CAPE programs. That's the type of workshop I would love to see, that we're talking about inclusion of all of our students.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Elkins. Yes, ma'am. We'll include
Dr.
that.
Grant, I'm sorry. Now, I was going to say, I think what the board is saying, members of the board have said thus far is phenomenal. But I would ask that we kind of pause and really dig deep and get in the dirt of inequity in Richland too. Like when we're talking about areas that we really want to see, I know it may be a little uncomfortable, but I'm asking us to push through that discomfort and really have the conversations about inequity. I think we touched on some of it was touched on. For example, and I'll lead for example. We have an inequitable way of identifying students for gifted and talented in our district. So what does that mean? That means there are certain students in our district who are afforded a different educational experience based on their ability to score well on math and reading in second grade. When we know that poverty has an impact on student achievement early in their lives, but we identify gifted and talented. Now, when I say we, that's what the state does. And so when we talk about systems of inequity, when we talk about practice of inequity, that was something that was created long before any of us became educators. But we have an opportunity to identify that system. And do we come up with something else? Do we come up with a way, to speak with what Ms. McFadden said, then how do we come up with an opportunity to identify our students who may be gifted in other ways in second and third grade? Because it's going to take some students multiple years to perform well on that test, but it doesn't mean that those students aren't gifted and talented, and it doesn't mean that they don't shouldn't get an opportunity to be exposed to types of experiences that our gifted and talented students are exposed to. So that's an example of an inequity. We do well with gifted and talented, but that's an area where we want to maybe think about. We also know, for example, we have one of the best, and I would say, and I've said this before, and I think it's a crown jewel. It's one of the jewels in our crown, our magnet programs. And I know it's a third rail conversation. So I'm going to be courageous and say it's a third rail conversation that eventually we have to address. It doesn't mean that we need to do anything different to our magnet programs. I'm not saying that. I think the programs we have are phenomenal, and under my administration, we've added more magnet programs, and we've had more magnet programs become programs of distinction, and as well as exemplary model programs in the country. Second only behind, I think, is Miami-Dade, if I'm not mistaken. So I believe in magnet programs, and I believe what they bring to the table, but they're supposed to create systems that are more diverse, educational experiences more diverse for our students. So the question I often ask is, and I think several of our board members asked this before, we don't provide transportation to magnet programs. So we know we don't provide transportations to magnet programs. And so we know there's a certain group of students who will never be able to attend a magnet program, not because they're not academically gifted enough to do it, but because financially they're not going to have the ability to get to that school, particularly at the middle school level when it becomes most competitive, because at the elementary level it's really kind of lottery based, but the middle school level begins to become competitive. But some students can't get to and from those programs. And so they don't get an opportunity to have that. We created the programs, but we did not create transportation to those programs. And that's an area that we need to look at if we want to say we want to provide opportunity to those students. So again, a system that we have, we do it well, good job, but here's something that we may have to dismantle, this transportation piece for those programs, so that students and families feel confident and comfortable in going ahead and to apply. So these are the types of conversations, types of things I'm throwing out. This is what we need to be talking about. We need to talk about. I think what Dr. Elkins Johnson just said is also a good an idea, because we have a practice where we don't replicate services in our school district. No one requires us to do that. We just have decided it's become a practice. It's not in board policy, but it's a permitted practice from long before, that if you have one program at one school, you can't replicate that program at another school. But in certain cases you can, because you can have culinary arts at multiple schools, and you might be able to have building and construction at another school, but you can't have barbering and cosmetology at other school because it's at one school. And we don't allow you to go to that school if you want to be in barbering and cosmetology. So again, we do a great job of offering a very robust CAPE program, but we created a process that doesn't allow every student to have equal access or access to that, or by trying to be equitable and ensuring that their student have that at their school as well. So those are the types of conversations I'm suggesting that we want to think about as we're kind of having this discussion. Let's think about those things that we know are there that we need to really, really focus on, or really at least bring to the surface to identify, because we're not going to be able to address them all. But if we identify it, then we can start building processes to dismantle them and then rebuild from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis.
Okay,
Ms.
Dr.
Mackey.
Grant. Oh.
May I make a comment to what Dr. Davis said?
Yes, ma'am, Dr. Elkins.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Dr. Davis said, but I just wanted to make the comment, we all are policymakers. He's the superintendent. So if he feels strongly about that, he can bring that before the board and allow us as policymakers to say yes or to say no. And that's what I've been asking for a long time. We make the policies, let's make the policies, and let's make them equitable.
I agree with that, Dr. Elkins Johnson, but I think we need to have the conversation first, because I think we all need to be hands in and boots on the ground when we're talking about some of these policies like that. That I want to make sure that we are all in and all on board with that, so that we're not having debate at the time that we bring the policy to the table. As superintendent, I'm also looking for direction from the board. I am expressing my passion for it, but there's also a level of direction. And we've never had this conversation before publicly like this. And so this is new for us. But I'm excited about the opportunity for us to have this type of conversation, because it goes beyond how we typically measure the success of schools by with standardized test scores. We measure the success of our schools by the opportunities that we provide to our students in our preparation to make them globally competitive students who are prepared to lead and excel in their chosen pathways. And are we maximizing their gifts and talents? And I don't think we can do that if we don't provide them with the opportunities that they need in order to be the best versions of themselves. And that's what this conversation will allow us to have some sort of roadmap and framework to bring back and say, yes, absolutely, this is something that we should do.
Dr. Davis, I do want to make a comment as well, and Dr. Elkins may remember this. Some of these conversations we have had, more equitable transportation for students has come up numerous times in the past. Replicating programs has come up. In fact, I think we did replicate one elementary school program, CFK, and we have CFK North now. And, I think one thing, and I certainly, this is not to throw a wrench in this at all, but it will come with resources to do some of this. And so I think when we get there, this is where the board is really going to have to dig deep. Because when we looked at equitable transportation, the price tag was enormous to provide busing. I think when we created R2I2, we looked at some busing opportunities. Last time we rezoned schools, we looked at, can we do, Dr. Caution Parker, I think you may have been part of some of that. We looked at, can we provide with more busing opportunities for students to get them to different parts of the district. And so there will be some resource issues that will have to be addressed. Not all of them will have a price tag.
Right.
But there will be hard decisions that come with providing it, a lot of these opportunities. And so that's where I think the board is going to have to dig deep. And Dr. Davis administration, once we do this work and define what it is, whether it's replicating systems, more equitable transportation, I know, Dr. Davis, you and I have talked about, do we add students to find opportunities as marginal students who aren't identified as gifted? Do we create our own system? That also comes with a price tag, because as we add students to our gifted program that aren't defined by the state, that's on our dime, not on the state's dime to provide those resources. So we will have some tough decisions that come with some of the outcomes from these studies related to resources and price tags.
Dr. Davis, also with the CATE piece, one thing I like that you said was, because I'm a CATE person too, I think I like the fact that you said you needed some direction from the board with the CATE practices. One thing that we need to keep in mind as we venture into that is the making sure that we don't just have random CATE programs. What we need to focus on is having completer programs, and completer programs that offer certifications so that those particular students can go out and get a job from the program that they're in. Because what we want to do, if we have limited resources, what we don't want to do is spread our CATE courses so far out and not get the most bang for the buck for the children. So when we look at that, we need to make sure that we're organizing our programs to be complete programs. And we also need to make sure that we're getting certificate programs. That helps the students, and that also, if it's still applicable, it still helps the high school's report cards. I still believe that, isn't that still part of it? I believe that, did they take that off? But what I'm saying is, so we're going to do that. We need to make sure that we're focusing on that piece of it. And also the other thing too is making sure that the guidance is aligning the IGPs with the student's particular career path, and not just placing, and I'm not saying they are, but not just placing students in random CATE courses, but making sure the kids that is their actual career goal are having the first opportunity on the schedule to participate in those particular programs. So there's a lot to look at with CATE. There's a lot of things that go into CATE. And I'm glad, and I'm gonna go back a little bit, because you hit on exactly what I was talking about earlier with the magnet programs and the opportunity in academic programs. That is a big focus, and I'm glad that you said we need to dive deep into that, because I know that that's a concern for the community. I've heard it repeatedly. So, and you're right, and I'm glad you said it, Dr. Grant, I'm sorry, that you said it, that the community should not look at it as if we're trying to take away from one group to give to the other. We're just trying to add and make it inclusive of everybody. So I appreciate that, Dr. Davis, and I appreciate that on both fronts.
Ms. Mackey, I know earlier you wanted to.
May I make a comment?
If Dr. Ellis, Ms. Mackey wanted to speak. If you don't mind holding just a moment, I'll ask Ms. Mackey to speak, and I'll come back to you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just wanted to echo the sentiment of Dr. Davis earlier. I know we were talking about one of the things my mom, who's been teaching school for 52 years, always said is, it's not how smart you are, but how are you smart? And so making sure that we have resources and quality facilities and things of that nature for all of the students to excel in whatever area they need to excel. We talk about diversity, and as we all know, diversity is not about just, the color of your skin or, your gender, but it's your socioeconomic status, your worldview, your perspective, the experiences you've had in your home, or the experiences that you've had as a culture. And so having, diversity of the teachers is not just the color of their skin either, but it's also because students need to feel identified by the person who is teaching them, and that may or may not be something to do with their culture or the color of their skin, but a whole lot of factors go into diversity and inclusion for a child to feel included. One of the things I appreciate, and I think Dr. Davis touched on that earlier, I know long before I got on the board, one of the concerns, there were some unintended consequences to decisions that we make. All of the decisions, I don't think any board or organization makes decisions that are meant to harm any, population, of any segment of a population. And I know one of the things I was concerned about with, some unintended consequences with, redrawing of attendance lines and things of that nature, and making sure that, each school had the resources that it needed, or facilities that were the same as others. And I can't remember having that conversation every year that I was on the board, but by the time the bond referendum came around, all of the things that we had talked about at my children's school, from the School Improvement Council and some other schools I know about, were a part of that. So one of the things of doing surveys and listening to your community is ever so important, because clearly that was the case with regard to the bond referendum, where all the things that we talked about and some unintended consequences, and, making sure that our facilities were the same, not saying that literally the quality of the facility, but that each school has the same, facility, or, would be it athletic or academic or whatever that other schools have. But all of those things that we talked about, and as far as I can remember, since 2014, because I wrote an article about that and that was picked up by some media outlets, but since that time, all of those things were included in the bond referendum. So a huge part of making sure that we are on point or either progressing, because we'll never, if you reach your destination and you stop growing, then that's also problematic. But one of the things that I appreciate about the district is that we are listening, and that we need to continue listening to, our teachers, our community. We as a board may have a great idea, and, there may be teachers, or administrators, or, people who feel differently or have some different ways that they'd want to tweak that, or they may be able to see the unintended consequences of a decision that we're making. So one of the things that I appreciate that we have done, and I hope we continue doing, is to continue listening to our community, to our teachers, to our families, to make sure that the decisions we make at this point are not just because we think it's a good idea, but also that they are implemented in such a way that we minimize unintended consequences. And I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ms. Mackey. Dr. Elkins?
I just wanted to make a comment based on what Dr. Holmes stated about certification. And I really,
There we got you. Mm-hmm.
yes, I just wanted to make a comment earlier for what Dr. Holmes stated. And I do understand about certification. That's why the programs that I actually mentioned were programs of certification, programs that students have expressed interest, as well as parents for many, many years. I am also a former K teacher for over a decade. And this has been a concern of parents as well as students for many, many decades. And I think it's just time for us to include all of our students. And I think one way is to begin, when we have these conversations, to bring some of the technical colleges presidents or their representatives, have them be a part of the conversation. Also, some of our surrounding school districts like Richland School District 1, which many of us are products of, to see how we can partner to make sure that these students do have a future when they leave. They are certified, and it is a program for career, leading into a career for many of them. So I think when we have that conversation, we first start with us, but we also have to have some of those other people at the table to hear how they can partner with us. And therefore, we don't have to worry about transportation, because maybe we can partner with Comet and some other organizations. So I just want to throw that out, that the programs that I am mentioning are programs of certification.
I think we do. I just want to say, I think we do a phenomenal job with our CAPE programs in our district. I don't want that to get lost in the CAPE conversation as we talk about equity. I think we have one of the most robust CAPE programs in the state. We don't necessarily have what you call a traditional vocational center in Richland too. And that's because at most of our high schools, those programs are housed there. So automotive and technology is at a particular high school. And I think to speak to what Dr. Elkins Johnson and Dr. Elkins and Dr. Holmes were saying, how do we get students who desire to have that, give them access to that? We were one of the first school districts, not the first school district, to establish the apprenticeship program with the partnership with Midlands Tech, where our students are not only getting hands-on experiences at places like Ram Clutch and places like Prisma Health, I forget the other places that skip my mind, but our students are not only getting high school credit, they're getting college credit, and they're getting paid. So we're at the forefront of that. So I don't want that to be missed. We've done a phenomenal job of partnering with our local our community to ensure that our students are getting the advantages they need. But to go back to the equity piece, are we ensuring that everyone is getting access to that? Regardless of what we create, if we're not creating a system where people are getting access to it, then we're not having, then that becomes an equity issue. Then so how do we solve that problem, or how do we address that problem? And I think it's also important for us too, as we do this, as we have this conversation, it goes so far beyond, and it's such a broad thing that we would have to limit what we can do in a period of time. And so we're going to focus on, so for example, if we look at academics, and the fact that a prerequisite course, a score in a prerequisite course at one school may be different than the score of a prerequisite course at another school, right? And so does that mean we can examine that, bring that back to the board and say, hey, we want to establish a policy that any course to get into, say, calculus AB, the prerequisite score is this at the district level. This is it. So individual schools can't have individual prerequisite determinations. Is that the desire? Is that the types of things we want to do, so that a student at Westwood High School and a student at Spring Valley High School stands the same chance of getting into the next course, which is going to help them regardless of what that course is going to be? Those things are similar. And we're not disenfranchising one population of students versus another population of students. And so those are the types of things that we're talking about, that when we're doing it, because it gets to the root of some of the systems or the systemic practices that exist that we inherited as educators. It's not our fault. It's not the district's fault. It's not the parents' fault. It's not necessarily, I'm not blaming anyone because these things haven't been done as of yet. But now we have the chance in this new era of public education to really take a hard look at where are we, and are these practices disproportionately affecting one segment of our population versus another? Are they disproportionately affecting African American students? The same way we looked at our suspension data. Was it disproportionately affecting African American males in our school district? The same way we're looking at magnet. Is there a disproportionate number of students who are not being served or don't have the opportunity to access this resource? Is there a disproportionate population of students who are being identified in special education? Why is that? What can we do to rectify those things? And so when we're doing or making decisions, we're looking at it through that lens. So if we're making the decision about zoning, for example, are we using an equity lens to look at that? What are we creating that is going to be long-standing? Because that becomes the precedent, becomes the next step. And so we just want to be able to begin to have that very robust conversation that does require some depth, and does require some digging, as I shared with the group before, to uproot long-standing traditions. And it's gonna, you gotta get dirty. You're gonna get your hands dirty. There's no way to pull up something that is deeply rooted in without getting dirty. And so we're gonna have to stick our hands in the ground, and if we see something that is not right, that is inequitable and is deep rooted, then we're gonna have to pull it up and call it what it is. And not be afraid to say, I think this practice hurts African American students. I think this practice hurts students of LGBTQ community. I think this practice hurts girls. I think this practice hurts students of a Latino X or ELL students. I think these practices hurt our students who are marginalized and disenfranchised. And that has nothing to do with those individuals who've never been marginalized and disenfranchised. It's not about taking anything from them. It's about addressing the fact that we need to provide the same type of experience for our students as best we can, and give them what they need in order for them to be successful. And I think that's important to say that, because Dr. Holmes is absolutely right. And Dr. Grant is absolutely right. When you start having this conversation about equity, there's a fear that you're going to take something from someone. And so people don't want to have the real honest conversation about it, because they feel like they're losing something. And we're not trying to take anything from anyone, but we can't continue to stand by and see practices that we know are hurting segments of our student body population and just say it's just kind of the course of, the course of doing business, and that's the way it's always been. So we're just gonna leave it alone. So, Dr. Grant, I don't know, you had other data that you wanted to present?
There's plenty, Dr. Davis, but we are 5 after 7. It's the pleasure of the board for what you would like to do. Because it's a journey, I know we can't do everything at one time, but I'll follow whichever lead you would
I
like
think
to take.
if the board doesn't, I think it would be important at least to let them see the data. We don't have to necessarily have a whole lot, because I want to have a moment to let the board ask any questions, just talk about anything that we want to talk about this. And so I don't know where you left off at from the previous slides that we had up there before the elementary students, because I saw a slew of slides that we saw several initially. But this helps it's important because, there we go, because it's important that this paints, kind of gives you a picture of what we're talking about. This really specifically focuses on some academic stuff, but it's a good place. Academics is a great place to start, because in the end result, that's what we're creating is critical thinkers and academically minded students who are going to go out into the world and change it. But here you see is all of our students identified as gifted and talented by race in Richland School District 2. And so you see by percentages, and you see where we've been over a time period between 2015 to 2020. The blue line representing our students, our Asian students, the red line and the gold line are representing our Black students and our Hispanic students, and then the green line represents our white students. And so you can see there's been a steady, somewhat increase over the last several years with our Asian students. We've seen our white students dip down back in 2015 to 2016 and then come back up in 2017 and slowly, gradually kind of increase a little bit. But you can see since about 2018, 2019, 2020, it's been pretty flat when it comes to our Hispanic students and our Black students. Less than 10% of Black students in this district are identified as gifted and talented in our district, where they roughly represent 60% of the population.
Question, Dr. Davis or Dr. Grant.
Yes.
With regard to the identification of students as gifted and talented, is that identifier determined by the district, or are those identifiers determined at the state level?
That is state identified gifted and talented by the measures that we use to identify them in elementary school.
That is very good to know.
I think the second, third grade for my elementary, end of second
grade.
It's end of second, and you can also identify in third grade, correct? So again, that's the point that we were making.
And I understood that. I wanted to make sure that we put that out there.
That's the point we're making when we're talking about the high number of students of color who live in poverty as well. We know poverty is a better predictor of students' academic success. And so giving them a test in second grade to identify them as gifted and talented, you know you're not going to have a higher percentage of those students in gifted and talented. So that's just the way the system's set up now. This is something that we would like to have some more in-depth conversations about. On the state level, I have brought this up multiple times on the state level and pressuring state or having conversations with our state leaders about why do we identify gifted and talented so early when we know that students of poverty are not going to qualify.
And can I ask a math question? So when we say 20%, or I guess it's 30%, a little above, are white, so that's saying 30% of our total population is white, or are we saying 30% of the number of white students?
We're saying 30% of the number of white students qualify for gifted. So the 30% of the white population of students in Richland 2 are identified as gifted.
30% of white, because white is a very small percent of the district.
30% of the 18%. White students make up about 18% of students in our school district, about 5,200 students. 30% of those students are identified as gifted and talented.
So numerically, how does that equate? So if I have 30%, because 30% of a small number is a lot less total number of students than 8% of a much, like over 60% of our population.
Right, so we're not looking at the raw number, because absolutely there will be more Black students that are identified as gifted, because 10% of 17,000 was going to be more than 30% of 5,000. So we look at it from a percentage. So almost like 3 in 10 white students are identified as gifted. Less than 1 in 10 of black students are identified as gifted.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood, because I think that's an important distinguisher to understand, that it's not 30% of our entire population, it's 30% of the white population and
Right.
8% or 9% of the African. Okay, all right, I just wanted to make sure I understood how that was cut across. Thank you.
And we did not run a comparison to that, but if I'm not mistaken, I think John Arnold is not in here, but I remember some data that he gave me about the percent of African-American students and the percent of Hispanic students in our district that are in poverty. So for example, 55% of our students are considered pupils of poverty, but black and brown students make up 70+% of the poverty of our school district. Mm-hmm. So 7 in 10 of them are considered students of poverty. So when you look at their performance, again, because I stress that because I always like to say that it is important that we as a school district and just in general, when we have educational conversations, that we sometimes extract the notion that by being born black or brown, you are inherently going to be, you're not going to achieve at the same level. Color or ethnicity doesn't predict performance. Oftentimes when data is disaggregated, it is, but what's a better predictor of performance academically when it comes to particular standardized testing is poverty. And so you follow the poverty, and you see where the most impoverished students are, then typically those students are going to be the ones that are not going to perform as well. And it doesn't indicate those students aren't gifted or bright. They just don't perform well on those types of steps because they haven't not built up. And we'll get to that at another day and time when we talk about opportunity gap, knowledge gap, learning gap leads to an achievement gap. And that's something that we've talked extensively about in the district, is that where's the opportunity gap, which creates a knowledge gap for our students, which creates the learning gap, which then leads to the end result of them not then the achievement gap. Dr. Grant, you can move forward. This is also some data for all 9th to 12th graders at all 5 of our high schools over a 5-year period that are identified as gifted and talented, that have took an AP class and also taken the AP exam. I know it's a little bit hard to see, and to speak to what you were saying earlier, Mr. Manning, you see at the very top, that gives you the percentage in the population. Mm-hmm. So 3% of the population of our students over this 5-year period, because this number is not necessarily accurate today in 2020, but between 2015 and 2020, the students who identify as Asian represented 3% of the population. For African American, it represents 62%, and for Hispanic, 8%. That number, of course, has gone up for Hispanic students in our district. For white students, it's 23%. That number has gone down, and for the economically disadvantaged, that number has gone up. But you can see, again, identified. There are 62% of the students that are identified as African American over that 5-year period. Only 8% of those students have been identified as gifted and talented, versus 47% of the students that are Asian versus 34% of the students that are white. And if you look at our economically disadvantaged students, only 6% of those students have been identified as gifted and talented over that 5-year period. Again, taking the AP exam, only 6% of the students who identified as economically disadvantaged, only 6% of them have taken an AP course. Taken an AP course. Not passed it, but just the opportunity to do it, to just take one. And this does capture the actual push that we started back in 2012, 2013, 2014, and so on, to increase that. But that's still an area that we need to focus on as improving and putting some structures in place to increase that participation rate for our students. We didn't disaggregate that economically disadvantaged, but I would imagine that if we did disaggregate that, it will probably line up similar to what you see in the total population of our students. You see that, again, our Asian students, who represent 3% of our school district over that time period, 55% of those students took an AP exam, took an AP class as well. Again, the same thing for 9th through 12th grade at all 5 high schools took an AP class by race. The data kind of speaks for itself. You see the economically disadvantaged, the Black and brown students are clustered together at the bottom of the chart. Versus our students, our age of Asians who identify as Asian, and our students who identify as white.
Dr. Davis, I think for me, at some point, I want to see the data further striated out, though, because I think that my guess would be if we look at Asian students in our district, you're going to see a much more singular socioeconomic group amongst our Asian students that's probably a lot less disadvantaged, would be my guess. I guess I just want to see, so I want to truly understand not African American just by African American, but African American who are economically disadvantaged versus the ones who aren't, to see. I just think that will help me to understand a little bit better, to pull those groups out, not just by race, but by race and socioeconomics, to understand the impacts.
We can do that. We do have Asian students
I'm not saying we don't have any.
We do have students who are Asian, who are identified as Asian, that are students of poverty.
I'm sure we do. I'm just saying on a percentage basis, probably less would be my guess.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. They only make up 3% of the population, and we already know that of the 55% of students who identify as poverty in the district, of those students, about 70% of them are either African American or Hispanic.
Right.
So there's only a small percent that's left that to be.
And I don't want to make it about that. What I'm trying to get at is I want to see not just race and then separate out the socioeconomic disadvantage. I think we need to see it all together. Does that make sense?
I'll get clear on it. Yes, sir. I'll get clear on it.
So what I'm trying to say is, if I have a if I want to be able to compare a white student who is socioeconomically similar to an African American student, and then look at that to see how different is their experience, both coming from a similar economic background.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Versus look at socioeconomic as one group.
So we can just disaggregate the socioeconomic category. Not necessarily the Asian, white, black, and Hispanic, but just disaggregate the socioeconomic category to see what percent of the kids that are socioeconomic.
I think it's more than that. I think I want to say, if I take Taylor Manning, who is white and socioeconomically not disadvantaged, and I take Amelia's child, who's black and not socioeconomically disadvantaged, are they having a similar access to AP? Are they having similar? Does that make sense?
Yes. I think we probably just sit down and help me follow up and understand exactly what you're trying to pull. I don't know if that information is going to that information specifically is going to answer the question that you may be seeking. But if it does, then great. If it doesn't, we'll try to dig a little deeper to get some more clarity on that. I think what should not be lost and try not to lose in this is that the vast majority of it's not necessarily about ethnicity than it is about poverty.
Right, but then you're pulling out and saying African American students, and we show them way down on the chart. But then you said earlier that that the number of socioeconomically disadvantaged African American students is much higher. So when I'm looking at the African American population, I'm going to see a skew of the African American population towards economic disadvantage if what you told me is accurate.
Okay. Yes, sir. I think the key here is this: is it's not the category. more so than the fact that these students don't have the opportunity. These students aren't performing are having access to AP classes and taking AP exams. And the vast majority of students, whether they're high poverty students or low poverty students, that cluster of students that are identified as African American is a mixture of both affluent and non-affluent. But the vast majority of them are non-affluent. That's why they're so clustered to the poverty. That's why they're so clustered to the line.
I think you and I are saying the same thing. And what I want to see is the African American student who is not socioeconomically disadvantaged.
But you're trying to make a comparison of one case to another case, and that doesn't give you the picture. You have to look at them together. So to extrapolate Baron Davis's children and compare them to someone else's child is not the same. It's not the same picture, because I have students who take AP classes and pass AP classes. They're African American, but to compare them to another African American student, those students that are like them are probably going to perform the same, but they're going to outperform the vast majority of the students of poverty that are African American and that are white and that are Hispanic and that are Asian, because the biggest predictor of achievement, it comes with
the socioeconomics.
And by far, the reason why you see them clustered there and why you see Asian students high and you see white students in the middle is because the vast majority of the Asian students only represent 3%. So even if half of them were that way, that percentage is so small, it's not going to impact the data as much as that larger percent of students that are African American and Latino, who are going to represent roughly 70 or maybe more, I can't remember, 70% of our students that are in poverty. That's why their data is going to be more. But I'll tell you what we'll do. You'll get the question from you. I'll give it to John Arnold and the accountabilities team.
Yeah.
And see if we can get you the data specifically.
I just don't. The opportunity gap is not equal, right? The opportunity gap for an African American student in poverty is not the same opportunity gap as an African American student not in poverty. Just like the opportunity gap for a white student not in poverty is different than a white student who is in poverty. The opportunity gap is not the same for each of those groups.
In some cases, it's not the same. I mean, this is a time to talk about it.
If we're going to get uncomfortable,
there are a lot of other issues.
You said you wanted to get uncomfortable.
No, I'm saying.
I want to understand the data because I think it's different.
In some cases, it's not the same. In some cases, it's not the same. I mean, the opportunities that are presented to in the district, we try to put structures in place to make sure that those students have opportunities. But in some cases, those opportunities are not the same. That students who may identify as white may have opportunities afforded to them that students of poverty may not have opportunities afforded to them. That's just the reality of the situation. And those are things that we need to identify, things we need to address, but that's not something that we were attempting to address in this.
And I want to say I'm not minimizing any group here. I think that it's important for me to not just, we can't say socioeconomic disadvantage is an aggregate group and then say one group is a lot more of that and then look at the African American group and get the whole picture for what's going on there. To me, I need to understand across all the different groups, the socioeconomic disadvantage and what that impact is versus just
here's what I can tell you. I can tell you if you compare a student of poverty that's Asian to a non-student of poverty that's Asian, the Asian non-student of poverty will outperform the Asian student of poverty.
Yes.
And the gap between them is greater than the gap is between ethnicities. So when you look at poverty in this district, if you look at poverty within an ethnicity, that gap between that same ethnicity, whether that student is in poverty or that student is not in poverty, is wider than the gap when you compare the whole group to another group, which tells me that poverty, whether you're Asian, white, Hispanic, or Black, poverty has a bigger impact on your academic performance than anything else. The only reason why those things are clustered, they're down there, you could take disadvantage out, economic disadvantage out, and not consider it. But what we're painting the picture is the reason why they're clustered together is because the vast majority of the school district is 60% African American, and about 12% at this current time, about 12% Hispanic, and that population of students represent over 70% of our students that are in poverty, which is above the 55% total district poverty.
And again, I don't want to mischaracterize my concern or issue that we have to address with that. I just want to look at the data also pulled out separately, just so I can see it and understand it.
And then again, what are we going to do about it? Because whether it's, I think the important, we will definitely do that, Mr. Mann. I'm not pushing back on it. We will definitely do that. But I don't want us to get hung up on the analysis by paralysis and not address the issues of inequity that the data is telling us exists.
Oh, I'm not asking to change direction for what we're doing. I don't think that was what I asked.
No, sir.
I just
I
wanted
know,
to see
but
the
sometimes we
data.
can get so bogged down into the nuances of data that we don't actually get to addressing the problem. I'm asking don't let us administration get bogged into that. Let us present to you what we're going to do to try to address the issue.
Okay.
Ms. Mackey.
Question, and I think I understood what Mr. Manning was saying. He wants to know how to extrapolate it out by socioeconomic, I guess, categories. And I think it's not that easy to extrapolate it just that way because there's so many other factors, but I get what you're asking. My question was with regard to determining socioeconomic issues and who's, less advantaged. I know at one point, when my kids were in high school and at SIC, one of the things that we were talking about was how students who are disadvantaged, quote unquote, are identified. And at one time, I think, the only identifier you could use was, their free and reduced lunch status. And then you can't necessarily ask that now. So when we're trying to determine, which of our students are more economically disadvantaged, what are the determinants that we use to figure that?
We use the SNAP data information which gives us a better indication of whether or not a student is a pupil of poverty. So we don't really use the term free and reduced. Free and reduced lunch still exists.
That's antiquated. I know.
Yeah, but that's mostly because they fill out an application. But we pull and have access to or afforded information regarding SNAP data to let us know if the student is Medicaid, Medicare, they receive some type of food supplements. And things like that, which gives us a better indication of the actual percent of students in poverty. So now we truly know that about 54, 55% of our students are in poverty, and we've seen that number grow in our district over the course of several years now.
And to that point, and you're right, that term is antiquated. I appreciate you correcting me there. One of the things that I appreciate about looking at the snapshot and trying to study trends instead of exactly where we are on a timeline is because if we go by that data, then there are going to be so many students who don't report that we don't know. We don't know who receive services and things, not services, who receive that kind of assistance or family. There are students that we don't know. So if you're watching trends, then hopefully we'll be able to capture students who would kind of lean toward that trend and we can't necessarily identify them. So I appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am. That agree. Again, this is for all students grades 6 through 8 at our 7 middle schools. Same type of information that was shared earlier, identified as gifted. You can see here about 50% of our students that are recognized or identified as Asian. About 50% of those students identify. So 1 in 2 of our Asian students at the middle school level identify or been deemed as gifted and talented versus 11% of our African-American students. What is troubling here for me is if you look at it from the position of ethnicity, you see that something is transitioning between middle school and high school that the number is dropping. Mm-hmm. So there may be something to investigate there as well. And I think the same could be said for our if I'm not mistaken, our white students. We see that number, they're more identified in middle school than they are high school. So I don't know what's going on with that. That's something for us to probably examine and see why that number changes so drastically. Again, this is the same chart. What we'll do is we'll get with John. I know Libby, I'm sure Marshalyn is writing this down, James Ann as well. We'll make sure that we get that information broken out and presented back to the board so that you can have it for future discussions. again, for all pre-K to fifth graders at the elementary level, about 4% of our pre-K to our fifth graders are identified that are African American identified as gifted and talented. 5% of our Hispanic students identify as gifted and talented, and our economic disadvantage again is about 4%. So again, hovering around. If you look at that chart, you'll see that our Black and Hispanic students are hovering around. Again, I believe it's because the vast majority of many of them identify as being pupils of poverty.
I think that's the one where we started, Dr. Davis.
Yes.
Okay.
So, let me keep going. Or you got it.
Yes, sir. I was going to say this, I think, is a good time for the wrap up. And again, thank you. Before I turn it over to you, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for being open, for being honest, for good conversation. It takes this type of conversation. It takes this type of back and forth for us to get a good, clear understanding of where we are as we start to think about where we want to go. And so I appreciate that so much. Appreciate the support always to my division and to this district that we get from our board. And I look forward to continuing to work with you as we move forward in this process.
Thank you, Dr.
I'm sorry, Dr. Green. Oops, sorry. Yeah, thank you is an understatement. Thank you is an understatement for what you're trying to do in your job, trying to take some of the diversity blinders off of so many areas of education, because there are so many areas, and it's not just reading, writing, arithmetic. So I appreciate that. Can we get a copy of some of the data slides? I was trying to screenshot them all before my iPad died, and that's my fault. But if we could get a copy of that, that'd be great. But
Yes, ma'am.
Bless you for your presentation. I appreciate it. And Dr. Davis, thank y'all.
I would like to say I have 4 children. 2 of them, one of them is a Duke Tip and alert program. And one of them graduated her 5th grade year with all A's all year and, in honors math and in honors English. And then I have 2, one of them that's in the credit recovery program every year. And I think that, from the time that he started in school, it was just consistent. He was placed here and there was never like an opportunity for him to I tried to get him into an AVID class, but because he wasn't in the AVID class before, he needed that prerequisite and he couldn't get in, those kind of things. So my 2 boys, they're actually 2 boys, African-American boys, and they struggle the hardest, but my daughter, she could get into anything really quick. But my 2 that are in gifted programs, that's because they top off the charts. It's like they have to top so high in order to get into it. But the other ones who are struggling, there's not an opportunity for them. And I do appreciate everything that has happened. But speaking for my children alone, I have 4 that come from different, they're all from the same background, but they learn differently. And so my youngest 2, or my 2 boys, I feel like there's no opportunity for them to even try to get into one of those AP courses, because of where they are. But I will say this, there is a counselor at Lonnie B. Nelson Elementary School who has taken upon herself to help students. Like my boy, one of them, he doesn't like to sit in class a lot. He's playing with his pencils, that kind of thing. And she created a program called, it's a leadership program, or Legendary Leaders, that allowed her to take some students out of class that weren't necessarily not doing bad, but just not doing their best. And she was able to take my son and some of his friends and do something with them during the day to make something fun for them and, make and create a way for them to have an outlet. And when they came back, their scores were actually improving. Her name is Dr. Sandra Grand. She's at Lonnie B. Nelson. And the program was barely off the ground last year. And, then everything happened. But, just little things like that inside of schools where you identify, that child might need a little something else, or this child might need a little something else. And that truly helped my child. So I can attest to, little small programs that counselors are doing within the school. And I appreciate that, for them. So I just want to say thank you. That was a great presentation. I'm looking at those 4s and I'm like, yes, 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 and yes. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You just described Equity, a program that helps your specific child with the needs that your child has so that he can be his best. Yes, ma'am.
Other board members?
Dr. Davis?
Let's one more. Huh?
I'm usually loud. I just like to say thank you, Dr. Grant. It was a great presentation. I appreciate everything, and I'm looking forward to really looking at that data when we get a copy of it. I appreciate you.
Dr. Elkins? Is Dr. Elkins talking? And her camera's off. All right, Dr. Davis, you said you had.
Your parents can go with you. Your friends can go with you. And so actually, at the governor's cup, they have, you know, the. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
I didn't have anything to say.
Oh, I thought I saw somebody nod to make sure I got you. So I'd rather overgive you an opportunity than miss you. Dr. Davis, did you have something you wanted to add?
I would just simply say I guess we're pushing up against time, but I would simply say when you look at these questions here, there have been some things that historically have created systems of inequity. And so when you look at these titles like state mandated, gifted and talented test scores and students, and I don't want us to just harp on that. This is really about a conversation of looking at all systems. It's not about a conversation looking at a specific system, but really helping us to begin to strengthen our eyes to have the focus to look at things through that lens of equity. And by doing that, we have to identify things of equality and no longer like just walk by them. And I don't say that to say that we haven't done a good job, because I still say compared to where we are and what we've done and what this board has done, with the policies, with the hirings, with the things, we have done a phenomenal, but this is a time to continue to sprint. This is a time to continue to run. This is a time to continue to get better at this, because the end result is that we are seeing and creating better educational experiences for our students. No question in my mind that we are not doing that. And by whatever measure you want to measure the success of our school district, I think we're creating that. But I think we have to ask the very critical question. When you see stuff like this, why are these things created? Because that gets to the root of why we have to dismantle them. And now that's a conversation that's the real conversation. Why the state mandated gifted and talented test scores, why were they created? Why did changes in the middle school math placement, something we did in Richland too, a couple years ago, and I think we reverted that, we fixed that. But why was it created? Choice and magnet programs and requirements. Why were they created? Now, this is probably going to get me run out of town, but I'm going to say it. There is a segment of our school district that have no magnet programs. There is a complete section of our school district that has no magnet programs. And we have almost 40 magnet programs, and that segment of our school district is virtually untouched with magnets. And we could be courageous and have a conversation about why that exists. And this could very well be my last conversation about it because I could round up some people. But I think it's important for us to understand why that happens. And there are high-performing school districts in our state that have no magnet programs. And I think magnets are great. I think they have their place and their purpose, and I support them again. Under our administration, we have added additional magnet programs, and we've made sure those programs have become certified, nationally certified. Because we're going to do it, we're going to do them right, and we're going to be good at it. But we have to ask why things like that are created. Why things like grading and homework procedures and all those types of things are creating a prerequisite. Why are they created? You know, why is the SAT? Why was the SAT created? And when you start breaking down those things and having those conversations, you can see part of that is to create or weed out populations of students, primarily students, marginal students who've been historically marginalized, Black and brown students. And so we don't want to make sure that as we're moving forward, as our population becomes more and more diverse, and our minority more and more diverse, we want to make sure that we don't have practices in place that are from an old way of doing things, from a system that we inherited, that we know are not right, that we don't continue those practices. Because those practices will have an adverse effect on our students, they'll have an adverse effect on our communities, have an adverse effect on our schools and our classrooms and our employees. And we want to make sure that we have open eyes and open minds in addressing some of these issues. I think it's going to propel us to be an exceptional, continue to be an exceptional school district for years to come. Yes, ma'am.
Why was TLC?
I don't know.
You don't know?
Will you turn your mic on? Yeah, it's for the streaming. Yeah.
Why was TLC created? I was there. I can tell you why it was created. It was created because of race. Denton Middle School was losing a lot of students. The families were moving further and further out near Spring Valley. And therefore, we were losing a lot of our white population. I think our numbers had gotten down to like to 800 and something. Well, when we started TLC, the bottom line for TLC, race. That was the bottom line for TLC. And that was back in 1990. And that's, of course, we first elected our two African-American school board members, very first ones. And there was a lot going on at that time, And they were trying to balance out the racial numbers here in the district. Well, I mean, look at all the changes. Look at where we are now. There was a major difference between 1980 to 1990 to 2000. And you can see as things changed, our programs changed. So I think you've got a good point.
Well, and Cheryl, actually, if you look at some of the recent grants that we've had for several magnets, and including some of the ones since I've been on the board, reduction of racial isolation is a specific component
of it.
And part of what we have to agree to.
Yep.
And so that they are put in schools that are majority minority with the specific goal in writing that it will reduce that racial isolation.
Well,
in some cases we have put those in, and I know I've questioned it at a few of the grants that we accepted. Why would we accept that, saying that we're doing that? Why are we, if that's the goal of the grant,
right?
Why would we do that, saying that the purpose is to draw white students?
And when you look at our population in our district now, and you're going to get a grant, and it's going to be all that's going to be based on the racial population, on how many we're able to bring into the program.
I mean, it's one of the goals is to reduce racial isolation.
But when you look at the numbers, it's just not there.
I think for us, because TLC is a phenomenal magnet program.
It is. It's outstanding,
and it's an outstanding program. I think for us, how we resolve that, and when we have that conversation, is how then we create an opportunity to make sure that if you want, or you have the ability to, you decide to apply, that we can remove a barrier that may keep you from accepting the position.
But
and if we can do that, regardless of how that's going to be, what that may be, how we come across that. But if a goal of ours is to remove that barrier, then that may reduce some of that all within itself.
And I'm trying to remember if you were on the board during that time when we were talking about rezoning back when Fred was still here, and we were opening, I believe, Blythewood High School. And looking
I wasn't here.
You weren't there.
Not for
well,
Blythewood
it was a
High
big
School.
hullabaloo. It was a big hullabaloo in that conference room, because the way they were designing it, it was just moving minority students as opposed to moving all students. That's what it was boiling down to. And one thing that I brought up then was about TLC. Why are we not replicating TLC? If we have TLC at Dent, why can't we put it at Longleaf? Longleaf had just opened. Why could we not have the same program there? And, you know, our board was a little different then, and that just wasn't going to fly.
Right.
But I mean, those are things that I think that we need to look at when we're talking about these programs. And you talk about choice, and choice is great, but choice also creates segregation. You know, in a lot of instances, and that's something that I think that as a district we need to look at. A few years ago, when Blythewood High School, we finally shut it down to choice. I mean, look at all the numbers we had out there. It was ridiculous. It was, excuse me, it was stupid. It was stupid. We should have done that years before we did it. Years before we did it. But anyway, that's my opinion. I'm speaking for myself, nobody else. But there's a lot of history there and a lot of things. When we look at our programs and we look at inequities and things that we've done in our district, you know, and as time goes on, we live and we learn and adjust. So I'm through.
All right, other board members, or Dr. Davis, is there any other data that you absolutely want us to see before we go?
I just want to say thank the board for the beginning of some courageous conversations. I think it's refreshing to be able to at least have a conversation to talk about some things. There's no changes made here, no wholesale adjustments at this, you know, being made. But the ability for us to openly have conversations about things like that shows our growth. Because you know what, regardless of who you may hear from, the community's already been having this conversation for years. And so you're gonna probably get an email from someone saying that, oh, we're trying to do this to the district and we're trying to do that. That's not true. The community has been having this conversation since I came to this district in 1999, and we were having a conversation in 1999. Yeah. We just rarely have it in a public space, but privately in homes, and things like that, and in certain neighborhoods and in certain circles, these types of conversations that have been existing. And every once in a while, they'll leak out and they'll reach out to us and talk to us about it, one side or the other. So to be able to have the conversation in public and at least talk about it and acknowledge that, hey, these are things that are there. Now, what do we do? And we will involve the community in doing that. So I want to reassure the community that's out there, they have a voice on this, and we will involve the community in whatever decisions we decide to take. But I just applaud the board for giving up this Tuesday, being here, being online, to have this conversation, because it says a lot about what you think about this topic. So I appreciate you all for doing that. And thank you to my staff, Dr. Grant, for putting a great presentation together, and our folk in accountability to help get the data for her. Thank you, James Ann and John, and all of our staff that's here. We just appreciate you. And, I always have to shout out my tech folk and Steve Brown and Mrs. McDaniels, who's probably saying, oh my God, what is he talking about? And Tony and all of you all for being here. Thank y'all. Thank you, team, for being here and helping us with this.
Thank you, everyone. With that, if I can have a motion to adjourn. Yes, Ms. Dr. Holmes.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Thank
Second.
you. Seconded by Ms. Mackey. Is there any discussion? All in favor, voice vote. Aye. Dr. Elkins Johnson. Yeah, I know. All right, we're recording it as a 6-0 vote. Thank you. Good night.